Hi everyone, my name is Nick Downs, and this time I will be speaking on the topic of the television series Lost, which ran from 2004 to 2010. It was wildly popular, so I'm sure plenty of you will be familiar with some of the things I'm talking about. So, in summary, it deals with the conflicts that arise among a group of survivors that have survived a plane crash, and now they find themselves on a South Pacific island, a remote piece of land. They have no idea where it is. It has various mystical properties which come into play later on, but more specifically I chose to analyze the conflict between Jack Shephard and John Locke, which are two of the main characters in the series. They are vastly different in their ideals and their character and the way they handle each other, so I found that to be particularly interesting from the standpoint of interpersonal communications. So, first of all, what exactly is it that I'm interested in between the two? Well, basically, their backgrounds, before anything else, are what put them at odds. We have Jack Shephard, who is a physician from a hospital in Los Angeles. Then we have John Locke, who has issues. Jack has issues as well, but Locke has issues. He is a paraplegic. He actually regains feeling in his limbs actually after landing on the island or crashing on the island. But anyhow, so that first point was what struck me, because it says in the text, it says conflict occurs when the parties hold disparate views on issues important to each. That's page 301. So in the case of Shephard and Locke, this issue is the island. So basically what happens is Jack Shephard is a man of logic, of science, who is convinced that if he just follows his rational side, that he will be able to come up with some sort of a solution that will get them all off the island. Whereas Locke is the absolute opposite. He is a man of, as they say in the show, of faith. He believes in fate, in destiny. And so the fact that he regained sensation mysteriously upon crash landing on the island is obviously very significant to him, so he begins to have this cult-like faith in the island and its properties, which obviously is very much at odds with Jack Shephard's philosophy, who believes only in logic and believes that this talk of fate and destiny is nonsense. So that is the first point that stood out to me in this series, is that the conflict between the two is basically the ideal example of a value conflict on page 301 of the text, because both parties not only disagree, but they disagree on the fundamental issue that is important to both of them, which is the island, but they differ on what they wish to do about it. So there are a number of scenes in the series that illustrate this conflict with regard to interpersonal communication. One of my favorite examples occurs when Jack Shephard is convinced that this ship that claims to be offshore, the crew claims to be offshore, claims to be interested in rescuing them. Jack Shephard is convinced that they're telling the truth, whereas John Locke wishes to stay on the island. He doesn't want anybody to leave because he feels they've all been brought there for a purpose, and that if they leave, they will be basically changing their fate and going in the wrong direction. So at this point, and I have the quote here, at this point the two confront each other. John Locke actually has a revolver that he has found somewhere, actually points it at his rival, and says that if Jack carries through with his actions, which are he's trying to communicate with the freighter, with the ship, via this radio tower that's on the island, Locke claims that he will shoot him if he carries through with it. So obviously this would classify as a perfect example of conflict. In fact, it's a conflict of values according to page 275, and this conflict fulfills the political category. I say, although it is somewhat theoretical since it involves the search for truth, it's mostly political since at the end of the day it deals primarily with leadership and decision-making. Since Shepard and Locke have differing views about what action to take, this could be classified as a non-shareable goal and a high-intensity conflict. That's page 299. Obviously, the threat of shooting someone would classify as a high-intensity conflict. So, of course, Locke is surprised when Shepard calls his bluff and states, "Shoot me," and this would classify as an example of competitive conflict, page 303, in which both parties refuse to compromise in any way. Of course, Locke does not carry through with his threat, and he lowers the gun. So that resolves that particular conflict, even though the overall conflict of what to do is far from over. So on another occasion, they are arguing over whether or not to push a mysterious button that is said to be capable of preventing a catastrophe of apocalyptic proportions. So Locke, as usual, is convinced that this button has something to do with his destiny, and of course his rival is convinced that that's nonsense and tells him that no one is going to push any button. So in this scene, in my analysis, I had written that the presence of body language is particularly evident, specifically the idea of emblems, spoken of on page 163, which include pointing and shoving, while affect displays, on the same page described, included squared posture, clenched fists, and direct eye contact. So, at this point, the conflict is still going on. I fast forward a little bit to several years later, once Jack and several others have managed to leave the island. So Locke eventually makes his way back to civilization, back to the city of Los Angeles to be specific, and he actually confronts his former rival and tries to convince him, for one last desperate attempt, to return to the island. Obviously, Jack is enraged by Locke's talk of destiny. He wishes to put all that behind him, and so he demands that he stay away from him for good. In this case, volume, which is described on page 166, is very evident. It's definitely a type of body language that conveys a lot of meaning. So, as the series draws on, basically what happens is, and once again I don't want to get into this too much, into the storyline, but what happens is the screenwriters write into the series this second part where the characters are living in sort of a parallel universe, some sort of afterlife. And it's in this situation, in this reality, that the characters eventually resolve their conflicts with one another. And that is also why I chose to analyze it, because it represents the opposite end of the spectrum. It's a good way of observing body language and how people resolve their conflicts. So, as I said in my essay, one of my favorite scenes that illustrate this is in the very last episode of the series, entitled The End. So in the recovery room of a hospital, Jack Shepard, who in his afterlife is evidently still a doctor, has successfully repaired Locke's spinal cord. And so when this happens, and when he's in the recovery room, they both experience a set of flashbacks, remembering their past on the island. And in this case, John Locke looks up at his doctor, Jack Shepherd, and he says, "Did you see that?" Now, what I find very interesting is because normally, had this happened in their previous life, Jack Shepherd would have immediately written this off as crazy talk, as just conspiracy, just nothing to be taken seriously. Whereas in the afterlife, when this happens, when they're in the recovery room, he gets teary-eyed and leaves the room. Now, I wrote in my analysis that this represents the turning point in his afterlife, because while he doesn't yet understand everything, he's no longer bitter and enraged at the prospect of destiny. In this case, he displays what's called avoidance, which is discussed on page 302. He displays this type of avoidance rather than aggressive competition. And so his emotional response to the visions, since it's very different this time, his body language is also significantly less hostile. So, with regard to giving them advice, what would I do? I know it's a fictional series, so obviously you can't give advice to fictional characters, but nonetheless, if I were in a consulting firm and I had to give people advice who were in similar situations, I would say that, first of all, violence is rarely, if ever, effective in resolving conflict, unless, of course, it involves life and death. Secondly, I'd remind them that it's always helpful to verbally acknowledge one's differences, because in the series, the two rivals never really sit down and acknowledge their differences. They don't sit down and say, well, I believe in fate, you believe in destiny, vice versa. Maybe we can get along. They don't do that. They just continually take out their anger on one another, take out their disagreements in a excuse me. Anyhow, so also I would stress that logic could have played a role in this a little bit as well. Locke could have shown photographs of himself prior to his arrival on the island, in which he was a paraplegic, and this sort of could have helped his rival in acknowledging that perhaps something mystical and supernatural was indeed going on the island, which it eventually was proven that the island did have supernatural properties. So in the end, however, in the afterlife, they do appear to find common ground in their shared experiences, and they do ultimately accept one another despite their differences. So this was the brief synopsis of some interpersonal conflicts in the television series Lost.